In the last lecture, we set the key attribute to counter.id. Using the same syntax, we can set additional attributes here, and with this, we can initialize our counter components. So I'm going to put this on a new line so you can see clearly. Now let's add a couple more attributes here. So I'm going to set value to counter.value, and also selected. I'm going to set this to true. For now, I have hard-coded this value. Potentially in the future, this can be set to a property in our counter objects. Now, back in our counter component, here in the render method, I'm going to temporarily add a console.log and show you this.props. So every React component has a property called props, and this is basically a plain JavaScript object that includes all the attributes that we set in counters component. So these two attributes, value and selected, will be the properties of that props object. Key will not be part of that because this is a special attribute for uniquely identifying elements. So now, let's save the changes and go back to Chrome. You can see we have 4 messages on the console because we have 4 counter components. Look at the first message. Our props is an object with 2 properties, value, which we set to 4, and selected, which we set to true. So now we can read this value and use that to initialize each counter component. So back in our counter component, instead of initializing the count property to 0, I'm going to set it to this.props.value. Save the changes. Back in Chrome, you can see our first counter is initialized to 4. Beautiful. So here in the render method, we no longer need this line. Let's delete that. Also, I would like to rename this count property to value to be consistent with the property that we are setting from the outside. This makes our code cleaner and more maintainable. We don't have to do all the guesswork to remember what name we used where. So put the cursor here, press F2, and rename this to value. We should also rename this count property to value. So it's more meaningful to say a counter has a value as opposed to a counter has a count. Now, one more thing before we finish this lecture. Back in our counters component, here I've set selected to true. If I exclude the value, by default, it will be set to true. Now, going forward, we don't need this attribute, so I'm going to delete it.